levels. We can talk about just a couple measures, how we get from the beginning of measure 1 to the end of measure 4. Okay, form is a very, very big topic, but in some ways it's the highlight of talking about music theory. It's putting all the different things that we talk about together so that we have a better understanding of how the music works. If we want to start at the smallest level, we might talk about motive. And we are talking about motive. Motive we might define as the smallest identifiable musical idea. It's one of the ways that our text, Koska and Payne, likes to talk about motive. The smallest identifiable musical idea, it could be a series of pitches or intervals that are repeated, like a series of pitches we have here that goes up a third, down a step, and back. That's a pitch motive that we could see over and over again in a piece. There are also what might be rhythmic motives that we see in a piece. For example, a pattern of rhythms, like this one we see here, quarter note, 2/8 notes, half note. We might see that developed and repeated throughout a piece of music. And we also might see a motive that combines both pitch and rhythm together. A motive that takes a series of pitches and connects it to a series of rhythms that we might see repeated over and over again. We'll be looking at motive throughout different examples in class, but I just want to get this basic idea to us that when we talk about motive, we're talking about a very, very small idea that we can identify, and often that we see as something that is developed and used repeatedly throughout a piece of music. Another level of form that we can talk about is bigger than a motive. We are going to call it a phrase. Our textbook defines a phrase as a relatively independent musical idea that reaches a harmonic goal, a cadence, is the name that we use for these harmonic goals. Sometimes you'll hear a phrase described as a complete musical thought. A phrase is larger and longer than a motive. Okay? Now, when we see these definitions, we might be a little bit skeptical, right? A relatively independent musical idea, well, what makes something feel relatively independent? And one of the lovely things about this chapter is that we have to do a lot of thinking about it. What we define as a phrase is kind of up to us as music analysts. We can look at a phrase and sort of say, well, I think these 4 measures feel independent, feel like a complete idea here. Somebody else might say, well, I don't know about that. I think actually 8 measures feels more correct as a phrase. There aren't always black and white, right and wrong answers when we're talking about musical form. What's important is that we understand the vocabulary that we're using, and we are able to sort of look at the music and use our observations to support what we decide, what we think the phrase is. Let's take a look at some actual musical examples. Let's listen to some short pieces, some short phrases, so that we can get a better idea of what we're talking about here. Let's listen to this phrase, and then we'll talk about it. This is an example of a musical phrase. It has a sense of completeness, of beginning, middle, and end. Okay? Doesn't feel just like a short motive, but rather like it starts somewhere and like it goes somewhere. I realize these are vague terms. Don't worry, we'll keep talking about phrases so we have a better sense of what that means. But again, we do have a sense of moving through some different chords and through some different versions of a motive before we finish our phrase. One thing we notice about this phrase is that it's built off a repeating motive. The motive has both a pitch and a rhythmic element that repeats. We can see that the melody has a repeated rhythm, quarter, 2/8 followed by half, and it also has a repeated series of intervals. It goes up by a third, down by a step, and up by a step. The idea of a section of music that feels relatively independent is something that we'll talk about and we'll get to understand more as we look at examples. One thing that's a little bit clearer is the other part of a definition of a phrase, which is that it ends in a harmonic goal. And the word we use for that harmonic goal at the end of a phrase is a cadence. Cadence is the term that we use for the harmonic goal at the end of a phrase. There are very specific ways that phrases typically end in Western music, and we have names for these different cadences. These harmonic finishes help a phrase have a feeling of conclusion at the end. Some of them have a really nice, strong conclusion. They have a feeling of stopping in a very sort of firm and authoritative way. Some of them have a feeling of stopping, but of kind of a weak stop, a stop that is more of a pause that wants to keep going than a strong finish. We'll talk about some of the different cadences, and we'll listen to them as well. Our most common cadence is an authentic cadence. The authentic cadence concludes a phrase by moving 5 to 1 or 7 to 1. Either of these cadences is an authentic cadence. It's very, very common. We see it all the time, and it has a strong sense of closure. It ends on the tonic triad, which is home base. 5 and 7 both feature the leading tone, which very much want to go back home, and so this is an authoritative, good finishing cadence. The phrase I composed for you a couple moments ago ends with a perfect, authentic cadence. It ends with root position 5, moving to root position 1, and the melody line ends on Do. It ends on scale degree 1 on the tonic. Let's listen to it one more time to hear that perfect, authentic cadence. Our next most common cadence is what we're going to call the half cadence, often abbreviated with HC. The half cadence is a cadence that ends on the dominant chord, that ends on 5. Again, we see this cadence very, very often. It contrasts with our authentic cadence because it feels incomplete. It feels like it wants to keep going. And so it has more the sense of a comma than a period, right? When we hear a half cadence, we expect the music to keep continuing onward. We're sort of sitting there waiting to resolve to 1. Okay? Phrases that end on 5, we call this a half cadence. Again, a sort of incomplete feeling. Let's look at an example. And again, it doesn't take much to change my phrase so that it concludes with a half cadence. I just have to change that last measure, and rather than resolving my 5 chord to 1, I'm just going to sit there on the 5 chord, stop on the 5 chord. And it'll have that sense of sort of hanging and wanting to go back to 1, but since we don't do it, since we pause on the 5 chord, then we have a half cadence. I added that leading tone in there just to bring out that tension, that B natural that really wants to go to C. Half cadence, definitely a cadence that wants to keep going. We want another phrase to follow this one that'll give us the closure we need, that'll give us some kind of authentic cadence. We started talking about form as how music is organized, how we can talk about the different elements of music and how they come together to create a piece, a composition, how they create the different musical effects that we hear. Today we're going to be talking about some different types of structural units beyond the ideas of phrase and motive that we already talked about. The first one that we're going to talk about is an extremely common musical formation that we call a period. So let's go through our basics of what a period is. A period is a formal unit that's made up of 2 or sometimes more phrases. Most commonly, periods are 2 phrases, but there are some we'll see that are a little bit larger. And those phrases form a particular relationship that we call antecedent and consequent. The first phrase is the antecedent phrase. And what makes this phrase the antecedent is that it has a weaker cadence, and it has a feeling of open. The antecedent phrase needs to be resolved, it needs to be answered. It sort of leaves us hanging, wanting something strong. And the consequent phrase, the phrase that comes next, has a stronger cadence. And it feels closed. It feels like we've sort of resolved that openness. Okay? This is all we're talking about when we're talking about a period. We're talking about phrases that have this antecedent-consequent relationship. And the way we tell that is through the cadences. Through a weaker cadence, followed by a stronger cadence. That's the number one thing we need to know about a period. It's weak cadence, followed by strong cadence. Let's get right into a musical example. Let's take a listen to this piece of music, very short, 8 bars, organized into 2 phrases, and I've already done the analysis for you. when we listen to this grouping of two phrases, we do notice that we have different endings for each phrase, right? Each phrase starts very similarly, but they end in a different way. They have a different cadence at the end. The first phrase has one of our weaker cadences. It has a half cadence, a cadence that stops on the dominant, that stops on 5. And that's one of those cadences that leaves us hanging, leaves us up in the air. We want that 5 to resolve to 1. But we don't get that resolution right away. Instead, we start our next phrase. We start over, and we have to wait to the end of that phrase to really get that strong 5-1 in root position, that perfect authentic cadence at the end of the phrase. We could describe this music as a period. It's a grouping of two phrases that have an antecedent-consequent relationship. The first phrase has a weak ending, a weak cadence. It leaves us open. It leaves us wanting more. If we stopped the music right at the end of that first phrase, we would feel very incomplete and dissatisfied. And then the second phrase, the consequent phrase, has a strong ending with a perfect authentic cadence. And we feel pretty good about stopping right there. That's what makes this phrase a period.
Hi, welcome to the Listener's Guide. I'm Steve, and we've talked some about short musical forms on this channel, and we're going to get to some longer ones. But before we do, it may be useful to go briefly into the nitty-gritty about how musical ideas worked in the 18th and 19th centuries. I like to compare this kind of music to writing, and before we get into how to read an essay, it can be useful to learn how we build ideas out of clauses and sentences. In music, we refer to these smaller structures as phrases. These are more or less complete musical ideas that a composer can string together in different ways to make a much longer piece. One of the types of phrases which we'll discuss today is called a period. Many people like to talk about it as a musical question and answer. It'll probably make more sense if you just listen to it. So let's have an example. So this is the main theme of Haydn's Last Symphony, number 104. Let's listen to the question that he sets up. You can tell we came to a resting point at the end of that musical idea, but it doesn't sound final. If you remember from our cadence video, that's because we reached a cadence, but not the root of the scale. The musical idea ends just above the root of the scale, so it sounds incomplete. So Haydn has to provide an answer to his question. Just as your teachers probably told you to do on a test, he starts by repeating part of the question, but he comes to a more final conclusion. This is called a parallel period because of that structure. The answer starts out the same way as the question, which helps create a sense of musical unity in the idea. Let's hear another example of a parallel period, this time from Mozart. Here's the question. And here's the answer. You can see the same basic concept, but this time the answer to the question starts on a different pitch. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be an exact repetition of the notes, but as long as you can tell it's the same material, we still call it parallel. The second main type of period is called a contrasting period. This is one where the answer to the question does not repeat any of the question, but instead gives something entirely new. Here's the question from one of Beethoven's more famous periods. Hopefully, after hearing a couple of periods, you can intuitively understand the break there and the sense that more music has to come to finish the idea. Maybe you've even got some ideas of how that could happen, and that's great. Or maybe you're still trying to get your bearings and you're mad that I haven't given you the answer yet. Well, here it is. Even though Beethoven repeated nothing of the musical question, the answer still brings it to a satisfying conclusion. And that's really all there is to musical periods. These tiny building blocks may seem simple, but they form the foundation of musical works that are much, much longer.
There are lots of ways we can describe periods. We can get very detailed in the way we talk about different things that happen inside of a period. For now, we're just going to use one way to describe our periods. We're going to describe our periods as being either parallel or contrasting periods. When we talk about whether a period is parallel or contrasting, we're talking about the motivic material that appears in our period. Rather than the cadence at the end, we're talking about what's going on in the melody, what's going on in the music. Parallel periods have very similar motivic material between the two phrases. And in particular, they have very similar material at the beginning of the phrase. Parallel periods often start with the exact same beginning of a phrase, or with a very, very minor variation. Contrasting periods have different motivic material at the beginning of the phrase. And so if we listen once more to the period we heard last time, we can tell that it was a parallel period. The two phrases had the same motivic material, not just in the first bar, but in the first couple of measures of each phrase. This is what makes them parallel. We can draw a diagram for that phrase we just looked at. Phrase diagrams are something that we see quite commonly when we're analyzing music. Each small arch represents a phrase of music. You can see I've represented both of my phrases with a small arch, and you can see that I've labeled the cadences at the end of each phrase and where they occur. The first phrase had a half cadence in measure 4. The second phrase had a perfect authentic cadence in measures 7 and 8. Above these phrase markers, I've put a letter to designate the motivic material that happens in each phrase. I used the letter A for my first phrase, and since I've denoted this as a parallel period, since they both have similar motivic material, I used the same letter again. But because the phrase ends slightly differently, it's not the exact same, I labeled it as A prime with that little slash next to it. If we had had a contrasting period, I would have labeled this motivic material as B. Finally, I've put a large arch over the two phrases to indicate that they form a period. This is a simple phrase diagram. I'll draw a couple more for you throughout the course of this video, but it's something that we want to get comfortable doing as we analyze music. It's a nice way to represent a lot of information in a simple diagram. If I changed the material in the second phrase, the motivic material, I would change how we described this music. We can take a look and listen at what's going on in this excerpt. I have the same 4 measures, the same motivic material and the same cadence at the end, but notice that I've changed around what's going on in my second phrase. Let's take a listen to this version of the 2 phrases I wrote for you. The phrase is still a period. The cadence structure is intact. We still have that same antecedent-consequent relationship. We still have a half cadence at the end of our first phrase, and a perfect authentic cadence at the end of our second phrase. But this is no longer a parallel period because the motives have been changed quite a bit. The second phrase now has a very different motive. It has lots more moving notes, lots of stepwise motion compared to the big leaps that we had at the beginning of the first phrase, and the chords have been changed quite a bit as well. I would no longer call this a parallel period. Instead, I would call it a contrasting period. And again, you can see my phrase diagram at the bottom has changed slightly. I still have the 2 small arches to indicate each phrase, and I have still indicated the 2 cadences and where they occur, but now I've labeled my motives as A and as B to indicate that they're different, that they have different ideas happening in phrase 1 and phrase 2, and that's why this is a contrasting period.